There's a slight change from what's in your bulletins this morning. And so instead of reading scriptures ahead of the sermon, today's scripture readings are actually included in the sermon. So we're going to do something a little different this morning. Last week, if you were with us, you know that we started looking at the last of this series of questions for this summer's Ask the Pastor sermon series. And the question was about how to make sense of the descriptions of God's wrath in the book of Revelation and elsewhere in the Bible in relation to the teachings of the Gospels that God is love. How do we reconcile these two different understandings of God? If we focus exclusively on teaching the love of God, do we neglect to think about the consequences of the promised wrath of God that will take place at the end of the world? And so last week, we didn't even get to the book of Revelation and what it has to say, because we started out talking about how the Bible came to be and talked about different ways throughout history that people of faith have interpreted the words that are contained in this collection of sacred writings. So this morning, we're going to take the two, again, very general approaches to biblical interpretation that we discussed last week and apply them to the book of Revelation and think about the very different ways that they understand this unusual closing chapter in the Christian Bible. But before we do that, let's take a moment to talk about what we know about where the book of Revelation comes from. Authorship of the book of Revelation is credited to John of Patmos. And legend has it that the disciple John was exiled to the island of Patmos late in his life. But there's very little evidence to suggest that this is in fact the same John of the Gospels. In fact, it appears from the way that the book is written that the John of Revelation might very well have been a bishop for a number of churches in Asia. Patmos is an island off the coast of modern-day Turkey. Map, please. There we go. Patmos is an island off of modern-day Turkey. And John writes specifically in parts of Revelation to the 7 churches marked here that are all in that general region. We know that the author of Revelation is very well versed in the Old Testament, and he speaks to these specific churches in ways that suggest that he has intimate knowledge of those particular communities. Now, most scholars date the writing of Revelation to sometime between 68 and 120 A.D. And while we don't know a whole lot else about John, we do know that he wrote to churches in communities that were under the thumb and under the control of the Roman Empire. Christianity at this time was still illegal, and acts of persecution were not uncommon. These were communities of faith that were desperate for the return of Jesus to vindicate and liberate them. We also know that the book of Revelation is what's called an apocalypse. It's a literary genre that was especially popular during this era of history. In fact, you can find apocalyptic literature elsewhere in the Bible, most notably the last sections of the book of Daniel, which happens to be the latest book written in the Old Testament. It was written around 165 years before Christ. Now, an apocalypse is a disclosure or an unveiling of knowledge. The subject matter of these sorts of writings are usually one or more visions that disclose or unveil either the future or the heavenly world or both. Listeners would have recognized this writing style as apocalyptic in the same way that we would recognize the differences between, say, a biography and a horror novel or a science fiction book just by reading a few pages of those writings. Now, knowing all this background helps, but how one ultimately understands the text depends on how they approach the Bible in general. And last week we talked about two very general methods of interpretation. And this morning we'll take a look through the lens of each method to see how they understand this mysterious conclusion to the biblical story. Now, one of the approaches we talked about was what I'll call a literalist approach. And as you might recall, this method of interpretation really became prominent starting in the 19th century and is generally based on the idea that the Bible was essentially transcribed by God and should therefore be taken completely literally, eliminating, according to this way of thinking, any means of interpretation. Many literalists would also claim that the Bible is without error. Now, a literalist perspective on Revelation, the scholar Marcus Borg calls this a futuristic perspective, is generally based on three premises. First, what Revelation describes has not happened yet. We haven't witnessed the sorts of things described in this book. As the inspired Word of God, the Bible cannot be wrong. So therefore, what Revelation describes must still be in the future. Now, based on those foundations, Revelation, therefore, must be a text that is full of cryptic clues that, if properly understood, will reveal the time of the second coming of Jesus and the end of the world. And there have been many, many attempts at decoding Revelation. But one of the more recent, more well-known attempts comes from a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, written by Hal Lindsey in 1970. And for the sake of our conversation this morning, I'm going to use some of Lindsey's ideas and findings as an example of how the clues in the Bible could be interpreted. Most contemporary literal readings of Revelation start with the recognition of the modern state of Israel. Now, Israel was founded in 1948 and is seen in this school of thought as a key sign of the end times. And that's based on a handful of biblical passages that talk about Israel being restored prior to the end of the world. And so using that event as a foundation and a waymarker, specific passages in John's fantastic visions are then linked to real-world events. For example, in Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 through 14, we read this. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and there came a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth. The full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll, rolling itself up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Now, Lindsey understands this passage as describing the detonation of nuclear bombs. The falling stars, if you remember our opening hymn this morning, that's where that comes from. The falling stars are satellite-mounted nuclear bombs that fall to the earth. The sky, rolling up like a scroll, is then a description of what happens to the atmosphere after a nuclear bomb is detonated. And if you think about the images of the mushroom clouds, you can kind of see that sort of image. Also in chapter 9, verses 13 to 16, we read this. Then the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the four angels were released, who had been held ready for the hour, the day, the month, and the year, to kill a third of humankind. The number of the troops of cavalry was 200 million. I heard their number. Lindsey argues that only China today would have the capability to field an army of 200 million people. So this passage refers to a rise in the power of the Chinese military. Also in chapter 9, verses 7 to 10, in appearance, the locusts were like horses equipped for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. They had scales like iron breastplates, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses running into battle. They have tails like scorpions with stings, and in their tails is the power to harm people for 5 months. So again, according to Lindsay, this would be a description of modern-day military attack helicopters. In chapter 13, the beast appears. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. Now, at the time that Lindsay wrote his book, 1970, the European Economic Community, which is the predecessor of the European Union, was nearing welcoming its 10th member country. So you can see how he made the connection of the unification of the nations of Europe and the arrival of the beast. He explains that the horn that had received the death blow the horn that had received the death blow and recovered refers to a future leader of the 10-party union who would also rule the world. Lindsay wrote that this was a, quote, future Führer who was already alive as of 1970. So based on these predictions, Lindsay argued that the end times were soon to be upon us. All of the imagery made sense. The rapture, where literalists believe that the believers will be lifted into the skies to meet the Lord in the air, and the tribulation, which is a time of suffering and death preceding the destruction of the world, were events that were just right around the corner. Now, this method of interpretation makes it easy to attach connections between signs in the text and things that we see in current events that seem to match up. But it also presents problems as well. By understanding Revelation as a writing that identifies these events as literal, definite future events, it can distort and diminish the teachings of the gospel. The good news moves from being about love and mercy and justice that Jesus teaches to a more inward-focused, a more selfish focus on whether or not you are one of the people who will be saved. Also, if the end is coming soon, that fundamentally changes the way that we interact with each other. Why bother protecting the environment? Why bother working to achieve social justice and equality if everything's just going to end anyway? Now, the other method we talked about last week is the historical method. It stretches back to traditions of the ancient rabbis, and it asks questions about where, when, and to whom the book was written. So before the terrific visions start in Revelation, there are addresses to 7 real and specific churches in that region of Asia. And it seems clear from this section of the book that there's a very specific audience that John had in mind when he was recording these visions. And that audience would have been situated in the 1st century ancient Near East. Now, the historical method also assigns meaning to some of the details in the visions, although from a different perspective. For example, that 10-horned beast that we talked about earlier, it rules the world and it demands worship, much the same way that the Roman Empire operated at that time in that part of the world. The text also tells us, fairly famously, that the number of the beast is what? 666, right? Now, according to scholar Marcus Borg, in antiquity, letters of the alphabet also had numerical values. And the technique for encoding and decoding a name in this way was called gematria. And according to those rules, the number 666 decodes to translate into Caesar Nero. Later on in the book, we're introduced to a woman who rides the horrible beast. She's referred to as the Whore of Babylon. And at the time when John was writing Revelation, the Babylonian Empire had been gone for over 600 years. So why would he link her to the name of Israel's most detested foe and one-time conqueror? Well, just like the Babylonians in 586 BC, the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And in many Jewish and Christian circles at the time, Babylon had become a symbolic name for Rome. So to summarize this historical approach to reading Revelation, here's three main points to consider. Despite appearances to the contrary, Christ is Lord, and Caesar and the beast are not. God will soon act to overthrow the rule of the beast and its incarnation in Caesar. Therefore, persevere, endure, be confident, take heart, have faith. Now, there are many, many other examples that we just don't have time to get into this morning. But I hope that this gives you a sense of the differences between the two different approaches from the two different methods of interpretation. And while this historical method helps to situate some of these visions in a more contemporary context, it has its own problems. Most notably, that as a book of prophecy, the prophecy was wrong. The end did not come during that first century after Jesus' death and resurrection. In fact, this is a weakness of just about any interpretation of Revelation. The author, and even Jesus himself, promise in the course of the book many times that these events will occur very soon. And it's not just Revelation that has this problem. Matthew, Luke, and John all include predictions from Jesus that he would return soon. Paul makes this prediction as well in several of his letters to churches of the young Christian movement. And the only thing we can say is they were wrong. So ultimately, whichever way we read this, there's problems with it. So what do we do now? Do we just throw out the Bible because it's not entirely factual? Do we give up hope in the teachings and promises of Jesus because he didn't come back like he said that he would? Is it all just a lie? But when it comes to the original question that got us into this conversation, how do we understand the wrath of God depicted in Revelation in contrast with the message of love in the Gospels? I don't know that there's clear, definitive evidence one way or the other. And so we're left to think about how this particular part of the Bible matches up with the overarching themes that permeate the whole arc of the biblical narrative. Now, people of good faith have been reading these same words in the book of Revelation for nearly 2,000 years and have come to any number of different conclusions about what they mean. Each of you will also have to make your own determination about what this knowledge means for you. But I want to leave you with one other thought. What if, when Jesus said he would come again soon, what if he didn't mean in the way that we expect him to? What if Jesus didn't envision a return that involved beasts and seals and trumpets and attack helicopters? I mean, that wasn't really his style when he was here on earth. And maybe one day he'll come back like that and it'll be a great day. But until then, what is it that we think happens when we share communion? What is it that we celebrate at Christmas every year? How do we explain what happens in those moments when we know beyond a doubt that the Spirit is moving inside of us? Is it possible that maybe, just maybe, that Jesus has come back and continues to come back again and again and again and again to reassure us that the promises are true, that a new Jerusalem that is open to all and is without pain, without tears, without suffering, without death, that is something that's in our future. That one day, all of us will gather at that beautiful river of life in peace and in wholeness and in joy. And that maybe, just maybe, if we're looking too hard for Jesus, we might just miss him altogether. Thanks be to God. Amen.